Bohm very much believed in he never really believed in the self-deterministic view.
Mm-hmm.
He felt that there was more of a causal view in terms of how a reality emerges and so on. But he talks about how the eternal unfolds in us. And just as the eternal unfolds in us, so too we, through our participation, can influence the eternal as it unfolds back into itself.
Mm-hmm.
So that, in other words, if, for example, our moral imperatives are aligned and we're doing good work in the world, it's like the wave breaking on the beach. When it unfolds back into itself, it comes back stronger. And then if we're doing bad in the world, likewise, the wave is coming back, but it's not coming back with any real moral strength, if you
Mm-hmm.
like, or taking us, if you like, towards a more enlightened view of reality.
Mm-hmm.
And out of, again, the quantum potential, we get this whole idea of non-locality, which really, I suppose, when you bring it down to very simple terms, is all about the profound interconnectedness of everything in the universe, where particles, no matter how far apart, at one end of the universe to the other, somehow are in touch with one another, without any signaling passing between them. And of course, this was the great debate when these ideas were first being talked about. How can we have non-locality and relativity? Because Einstein's relativity is all about, matter breaks up at the speed of light. So that there was this great conflict, about relativity, which is all about signaling, from A to B. But non-locality is about communication that is going on all the time between particles at one end of the universe, between you and me, between everything in existence, with no signaling passing between them, which in a sense is a kind of a proof of our interconnectivity. And again, if you apply that in a moral sense, or in a religious sense, or in a spiritual sense, it basically means if I am harming another, I'm harming myself.
Yeah.
If I am doing good to another, I am giving myself a gift in a way, that in a sense, we are all bound by a kind of mutuality, that what I do to one will affect others.
Yeah.
And this, again, not only in terms of us humans, but in terms of how we're treating our planet, how the household we all share. So in a sense, all of the science, if you like, that David Bohm was immersed in. And it's very much my feeling that David Bohm, I see him as a visionary scientist, but I also see him as a spiritual man. I suppose in the same way that the Dalai Lama now sees himself as a 50% Buddhist and 50% scientist. But I think that all of these great ideas about our essential interconnectivity, all at the end of the day boil down to the necessity that we respect one another, that we love one another, that we take care of one another, and this is where the idea of undivided wholeness that Bohm gives us, I think, is such a great platform for all of this, and feeds beautifully into mystical traditions. It feeds into Christianity. It feeds into, so I think that this is where you get a kind of the nexus, if you like, between science and spirituality. So that in a sense is, I think, what's so appealing about Bohm, the physicist, Bohm the scientist, and Bohm the spiritual man.
Yeah, I like how you describe how a kind of mysticism and morality come out of the scientific basis of interconnectedness, that when you're harming or hurting, you're not only harming someone else. There is no separate other. You're harming other, you harm yourself. Maybe even you harm the whole universe
Indeed.
as you do ill in the world.
And I think when you begin to understand that we are the universe, that it's not really the parts that make the whole; it's the whole that is invested in each and every part of the universe, and that's really, I think, what we need to learn, what we need to, and it's very interesting because I was totally amazed at how successful the film was and still is. And there's going to be another wave now when we release the director's cut. But I think the global pandemic, in a way, helped us in a very interesting kind of way, because we were originally going to release it through, the traditional ways, through traditional television and so on. But when the pandemic happened, one of our distributors came up with the idea and said, no, why don't we just do it all virtually? And we actually put the film out there for a period of 3 months for free. And it was just amazing. We just got south of 1 million views on YouTube in that period. And the demand for it is just incredible. And the director's cut now, as I say, that will kind of, I think, excite another wave of interest. And it will be going on some of the streaming broadcasters in the US. And it'll be available, obviously, through iTunes and Amazon and so on, and available through our own website and so on. But I was just, I couldn't believe the wave of interest in it, because I think people in the pandemic were beginning to realize how vulnerable, in a way, our institutions are, our economic, our cultural, our political structures, that suddenly they can be, they can fall apart quite easily. And I think people were thinking perhaps of maybe how could we develop new models? How could we, and I think Bohm, with his groundbreaking ideas in physics, reached out into dimensions beyond physics, into the spiritual. And I think that this is what kind of caused great chords, if you like, to start ringing in people's minds or spirits and so on. But the response has just been tremendous.
It's a good time to think about our place in the universe. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah.
I remember from the film, there was a part where you talked about David Bohm, a scientific paper that he wrote. He was very excited about putting his ideas into scientific language, submitting it for peer review. And then he got a very disappointing response, to put it mildly.
Yeah.
Why do you think other physicists found it so hard to accept the point of view that he put, even into scientific language?
Well, there's a couple of reasons for that. You must remember the time that Bohm, you're referring directly to his hidden variables paper, right? And Bohm had started work on that when he was in Princeton. And you remember that there was they were building the atomic bomb at the time, and Bohm was very close to Oppenheimer, and he was of course he was very close to Oppenheimer when he was at Berkeley. He went on to Princeton later. I think it was Wheeler, I think, recommended him, but they could clearly see that he had a kind of a maverick genius that they wanted to explore. So he was greatly accepted in the beginning. But of course, during the whole Los Alamos and the building of the atomic bomb, the Americans were building the bomb, and interestingly enough, the Americans and the Russians were allies fighting the Germans. But still, there was this great paranoia about communism, that was pervading everything. And, there was this debate going on at the time, should we help the Russians? Should we because after all, they were our allies during the war and so on. And the situation was that there were suspected leaks coming out of Los Alamos, and that these leaks were getting into the hands of the Russians. And of course, there was, as I say, great paranoia about communism and so on. But very interesting, Robert Oppenheimer himself was very interested in communism, and in fact regarded himself as a communist. Bohm and many others, young physicists at the time, were invited into a group by Oppenheimer that explored communist ideals. And there was this whole idea about, could an individual be free within a collective like communism? And it's very interesting that in Bohm's work in physics, everything he did in physics echoed his wider philosophical views. Like, for example, we go to a lot of lengths in the film. His initial work about plasma and metals, when Bohm was looking at how electrons behave, he found that the electron within the experiment was relatively free within, if you like, the collective of the experiment. So he was kind of thinking that perhaps an individual, a human individual, could be free within a collective like communism. So they were debating all of these ideas among the physicists, and a lot of them, as I say, were very interested in communism. But then when the leaks were suspected from Los Alamos going to the Russians, the American government, they set up the McCarthy inquests. And of course, McCarthy did inquests even into Hollywood, suspected writers in Hollywood who were communists and so on. But because David Bohm was part of the group, that were interested in communism, he was put under the spotlight in the McCarthy inquest, along with many others. Now, of course, eventually he was completely cleared, and I won't go into the details of pleading the fifth or pleading the first and all of that kind of thing. But even though he was cleared of any suspicion of passing leaks over to the Russians or anything like that, the communist trait, if you like, stuck with him. And his peers at Princeton and the authorities at Princeton, because he was involved in the McCarthy inquiries, wanted to keep him at arm's length. And they didn't renew, if you like, his contract. He was an assistant, I think, professor of physics at that time. And Oppenheimer himself, of course, he was untouchable because he was supervising the whole atomic bomb program. And when the fallout of the McCarthy inquiry, basically after all the deliberations, there was a sense in Oppenheimer that he wanted now to remove himself, even though he was a communist himself, but untouchable as far as the American government were concerned, because he was the supremo at Los Alamos, and he was spearheading the whole atomic bomb program. He had to distance himself from the others who were associated with, even though Bohm was one of his prize students. He had to distance himself. Now, Bohm wrote his famous hidden variables theory, and that theory really changed everything, but it wasn't recognized at the time. But Oppenheimer called a group of the leading physicists at the time to discuss Bohm's paper.
Yeah, you talk about that in the movie.
Yeah, and Oppenheimer put out this now famous statement, right, that if we cannot find fault with Bohm, we must ignore him. we must continue to ignore him, right? And that was all political fallout.
I see.
Political fallout from the whole McCarthy investigation, to such a point also that Bohm was forced into exile.
Mm-hmm.
He had to go to Brazil.
Yeah.
Einstein actually came to his defense, but Oppenheimer wanted him out of the way because of his associations with, and even though he could find nothing wrong with Bohm's paper, he said, we have to ignore him.